is a high-caste Hindu of full Indian blood born in Punjab, India, considered a white person? This profound question was put before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1923. Welcome to Echoes of Time, where we unravel the complex history of race, citizenship, and identity in America. The plaintiff, Bhagat Singh Thind, was an educated, English-speaking Indian immigrant and a U.S. Army veteran. He had already attempted to naturalize as a U.S. citizen twice, arguing that he was white. This was crucial because at the time, Congress explicitly limited naturalization to free white people and aliens of African ancestry and nativity. So, what does this little-known, yet profoundly consequential court case reveal about the broader narrative of white supremacy and citizenship in America? You might be surprised by what it tells us about the very definition of whiteness itself. On July 4, 1913, 20-year-old Bhagat Singh Thind arrived aboard the SS Minnesota in Seattle, Washington. Between 1900 and 1920, over 14.5 million immigrants arrived in the U.S., and Thind was one of approximately 8,000 South Asians who had emigrated to the United States during this period of mass immigration. At the time of Thind's arrival, the U.S. population exceeded 92 million, meaning South Asians constituted only a tiny fraction of the overall populace. The relatively few Indians who arrived were primarily from the Punjab region, then under British rule. Most hailed from rural farming villages and small towns in India, and upon arriving in the U.S., they were often relegated to grueling, low-paying labor. South Asians arrived amidst rampant anti-Asian hysteria, and Indians quickly became the next perceived wave of an Asiatic invasion. A 1911 U.S. Immigration Commission report even labeled Indians the least desirable race of immigrants admitted thus far. Just 6 years later, in 1917, all Indian and most Asian immigration was effectively banned through the creation of a barred Asiatic zone. Asian immigrants are incredibly diverse, hailing from numerous countries across the continent, each with distinct histories, cultures, religions, and ethnicities. However, once in the United States, they were frequently and unfairly lumped together as Orientals or as an Asiatic invasion. This categorization, in the American mind, forced South Asians into an existing framework that portrayed Asian immigrants as economic competitors, unassimilable aliens, and a threatening horde. Citizenship was, and remains, a crucial pathway to social and economic opportunity. Without citizenship, many states barred Asian immigrants from voting, becoming doctors, lawyers, or government workers. They were restricted from owning land and had little protection against deportation. For immigrant men like Thind, the only path to U.S. citizenship was through naturalization, the process of voluntarily becoming a citizen as opposed to being born one. The first federal law on naturalization, the Federal Naturalization Act of 1790, explicitly limited citizenship to free white people. Following the Civil War, the Naturalization Act was amended to include aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent, thereby granting citizenship to millions of black people who had previously been enslaved and lived without such rights. Even then, citizenship did not automatically confer equal rights. At the time, there was no comprehensive legal definition of whiteness, yet legal precedent did exist. Most European immigrants arriving during the 19th and early 20th centuries were able to naturalize, and their whiteness was rarely contested by the courts, despite enduring periods of acute discrimination. Conversely, immigrants from across Asia faced immense difficulty in naturalizing. This included not only Indians, but also Syrians, Afghans, and Armenians, who nevertheless applied for, and sometimes won, citizenship. How? Not all judges agreed on what constituted whiteness or white enough, but appearances undeniably played a crucial role. As legal historian Hardeep Dillon explains, embracing Western dress, hairstyles, and English in U.S. courts fostered a sense of visual whiteness and upper-class decorum that was required of those proximate to whiteness to naturalize as U.S. citizens. In 1917, the very year Indians were barred from immigrating, Thind submitted his declaration of intent to naturalize to a county clerk in Oregon, boldly listing his color as white. Thind hoped to join the small group of mostly well-to-do Indian immigrants who had successfully naturalized in lower courts. While awaiting approval for his application, Thind enlisted in the U.S. Army. Despite the rampant xenophobia prevalent at the time, the military actively recruited immigrants and non-citizens to serve. Thus, Thind received his first certificate of U.S. citizenship while stationed at Camp Lewis in Washington state. Yet, just 4 days later, the federal government shockingly revoked it. In 1919, Thind applied for citizenship a second time. However, a federal agent from the Bureau of Naturalization sought to convince the court that Thind was ineligible for naturalization. The district judge, however, acknowledged Thind's military service and his genuine affection for the Constitution, laws, customs, and privileges of this country. The judge also referenced a line of cases that had previously affirmed Indians as white. Consequently, on November 18, 1920, Thind was granted citizenship a second time. This ruling, however, would not stand. The Department of Justice had been meticulously tracking Thind's applications from the outset. The government was determined to prove, once and for all, that Indians were not white, and it planned to use Thind's case as its definitive test. Consequently, the Department of Justice appealed the ruling, and the case ultimately made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. On January 11, 1923, the Supreme Court began hearing arguments in United States v. Bhagat Singh Thind. This represented Thind's final opportunity to become a citizen by proving his whiteness. The Supreme Court explicitly framed the case as a test of the Naturalization Act and its intended definition of whiteness. To argue for Thind's whiteness, his lawyers built upon previous naturalization cases, assembling arguments that had previously convinced lower courts that Indians were indeed white. First, they argued that as a high-caste Indian, Thind was racially pure because high-caste families purportedly did not intermarry with other communities. Furthermore, his lawyers contended that, due to this supposed racial purity, Thind shared a common Aryan ancestry with Europeans. Therefore, as an Aryan, Thind was Caucasian and by extension, white. The now debunked notion of a common ancestry stemming from a supposed Aryan invasion would, chillingly, later be co-opted by the Nazis, but that's a topic for another time. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected all of Thind's arguments. Ironically, they dismissed the scientific racism employed by Thind's lawyers, yet ultimately arrived at an equally racist conclusion. In the final ruling, Justice Sutherland noted that while a blonde Scandinavian and brown Hindu may have once had a common ancestor, the average man would see unmistakable and profound differences between them today. In essence, Thind simply did not look white enough to the 9 white men on the bench. According to the court, all Indians were definitively of Asiatic stock and therefore ineligible for U.S. citizenship. Full stop. The fallout from the trial was swift and devastating. Indians became the first group in the U.S. to have their naturalized citizenship retroactively revoked. Between 1923 and 1926, over 70 naturalized Indians were stripped of their citizenship. They found themselves, along with their wives and children, in a precarious social, economic, and legal limbo. Among those affected was the Bagai family. Vaishno Das Bagai had immigrated with his family from Peshawar, a city now part of modern-day Pakistan. In 1915, Bagai settled in San Francisco with his wife Kala and their 3 young sons, Bridge, Madan, and Ram. Bhagat enthusiastically embraced his new life in America. He wore Western suits, spoke fluent English, adopted Western mannerisms, and even opened a store, Bhagat's Bazaar. But the Thind ruling unraveled the life of the Bhagat family, who not only lost their citizenship, but subsequently their livelihood. In 1928, Vaishno attempted to visit his relatives in India, but was denied a U.S. passport. This proved to be the final straw for Vaishno, who tragically took his own life in an act of both grief and protest. Vaishno sent a letter to the San Francisco Examiner, which published wrenching excerpts, including, "Is life worth living in a gilded cage? Obstacles this way, blockades that way, and the bridges burnt behind." The Thind ruling emboldened the U.S. government to revoke citizenship from other immigrant groups, including Mexicans and Afghans. It also paved the way for the most comprehensive and restrictive immigration act to date, which passed Congress with overwhelming support in 1924. Thind finally received U.S. citizenship in 1935, thanks to a new law that permitted all veterans, regardless of race, to naturalize. He earned his Ph.D. in theology and English literature at UC Berkeley and went on to lecture on metaphysics. Thind passed away in 1967. During the last 2 decades of Thind's life, immigration and naturalization policies slowly began to change. A series of federal laws, beginning in 1946, once again opened immigration to Indians, though these laws still maintained quotas that privileged certain countries over others. Nevertheless, the decades that followed saw large-scale immigration from India and other Asian countries. As of 2020, over 5.5 million people identified as Indian or Pakistani in the U.S. Census. That same year, the city of Berkeley, California, named a street after Kala Bhagat, Vaishno's widow, almost a century after her family had been driven out. After the tragedy of Vaishno's death, Kala persevered despite a profoundly uncertain future. She remarried, put her 3 sons through college, and eventually became a U.S. citizen in 1946. She dedicated herself to building community for other South Asian immigrants, hosting functions for women who immigrated as restrictions loosened after 1965. By the time of Kala's death in 1983, she was affectionately known as Mother India. Race continues to animate our discussions around immigration. Indeed, immigration persists as a top campaign issue, and our elections still frequently feature explicitly racist rhetoric about immigrants. Legal scholar Amanda Frost estimates that over the last 2 centuries, millions of people have had their citizenship revoked. And denaturalization continues to this day, whether for minor errors on applications or the actual wrongful deportation of American citizens, particularly those living near the Mexican border. As the daughter of South Asian immigrants, the question of what it means to be American is a constant one. Balancing the desire to belong without losing one's cultural identity remains a perpetual tightrope that all immigrants must navigate to this day. Bhagat Singh Thind's case and the tragic story of Vaishno Das Bhagat serve as poignant reminders of the struggles faced not just by South Asian immigrants, but by all immigrants who exhibit courage and resilience in the face of incredible uncertainty to claim a piece of the American dream.